Hey everyone, Scott here to discuss Minari, starring Stephen Yun, Alan Kim, Yuri Han, Noel Kate Cho, Yo Jung Yeon, Scott Hayes, and Will Padden, and directed by Lee Isaac Chung. Now, I watched the movie twice on as a rental on Apple TV, and I thought this movie was at the first time I saw it anyways, I thought this movie was going to go a little bit racial, and I was fearing that right off the bat. So, will it go there? Let's get into it and we'll see. The movie opens with Jacob, played by Stephen Yun, Monica, played by Yer Han, Anne, played by Noel Kate Cho, and David, played by Alan Kim, moving into a house in Arkansas that looks like a trailer so Jacob can grow his garden around the open land, which is really a farm, because he grows it like one. But he thinks it's the same thing as a garden, but the difference is a garden is a smaller plants and a farm is making food from the ground, and what Jacob is making is considered a farm. David has a heart problem where he can't run at all, while Jacob wants the farm garden, let's call it, and Monica is working at checking white baby chicks as male versus female, and I'm talking about the chicks as the in the creatures, not that'll grow into chickens eventually. And Anne is the older sister helping David out for most of the film, and I like we get to know these characters. And one more thing, I didn't realize until like halfway into the movie that the decade they're living at is in the 1980s, and that's a good decade to start this movie. Jacob and Monica talk about bringing Monica's mother, aka David and Anne's grandmother, whose home is Sunja, played by Yu Jung Yeon. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Please forgive me. While the first night of staying in a new house, there's a tornado warning while Jacob and Monica argue about how much money they need to stay in Arkansas. And where does the movie go? But instead, Monica wants to move back to California. The next morning, David wets his bed, and hides it while he's drinking Mountain Dew. And the movie is well made, and the story is good, but not as good as last year's Best Picture winner, Parasite. But it's around the neighborhood. Jacob teaches David to do things the Korean way, which is dig with a shovel to find water, and they think with their minds and to also use their hands at times. And any Koreans watching this, don't kill me. I'm not trying to be racist, excuse me. That's what the movie said. Remember, I'm quoting this movie. As Jacob wants to start his own business from his garden farm, Jacob hires a worker for his garden farm named Paul, played by Will Padden, who looks pretty bad in this movie, and I get the impression he didn't age very well, but it is a good performance. But hell, the whole movie has tremendous performance from these actors, and I believe them as the characters they're supposed to play. And director Lee Isaac Chung does a fantastic job at making these actors play the roles they're supposed to play in this movie. And I have to say, about 70 to 75% of this movie is subtitled, and there's about 25% of English. And I'm not one for foreign films, but like last year's Parasite or some of Guillermo del Toro's movies, I like this movie as I can follow it quite well. Sunja arrives as David is very shy of his own grandmother, as he doesn't get the impression she's a grandmother and thinks she looks like a younger lady, but is still very shy of her. Eventually, David will warm up to her, and as she gives him a pack of playing cards for Koreans, and I like David's character as I relate to him the most because of his arc of a little boy turning big. David doesn't like the expensive drink Sunja brings to their house and wants to sleep in Anne's room because Sunja smells like Korea despite he's never been there before, and she can't cook, but what she can do is cuss around David and Anne, which is my opinion not very good parenting nor grandparenting, as she isn't a real grandmother while she gets David to a dangerous creek for snakes reasons, and Sunja wants to plant Minari by the creek, and the movie does a good job at telling the story from their point of view. For example, when David prays, he can see heaven while he's asleep for his heart reasons. I also like that it's only meant for kids, that thing I just brought up, which makes perfect sense. And another example, if he's dreaming of going to the bathroom, he has to ask himself if it's a dream and pinches his cheeks. The family goes to church for the first time, and Monica gives a $100 bill donation to the church, and Sunja takes it back, which is pretty messed up in my opinion. David meets Johnny and makes a friend and asks him if he wants to sleep at Johnny's house. And Sunja and Monica says no because of a broken ding dong, as they call his private area. I won't say what it is, which is his private neighborhood. And I was afraid the scene was going to go racial as this whole movie, but for my first viewing, anyways. And luckily, it doesn't. And we see Paul carrying a cross like Jesus did. In the next scene, Sunja watches wrestling on the TV, and David pees in her bowl of drink as she thinks it's Mountain Dew, and David gets punished by hitting himself with the stick as he accidentally breaks it by falling and goes outside to get a new one and grabs a tiny stick, and it does go nowhere. But I like to see how the Asian culture is like in real life and on film. Jacob is out of water in the garden, and he worked too hard he can't lift his arms. Monica helps him with his shirt and his bath, and while the bath, Jacob says something about if Arkansas doesn't work, she can leave him and take the kids, which her which with her, which will probably set up the ending, which I'll get to a little later. Jacob runs out of water and gets a cancellation on an order that was just about ready. Meanwhile, Anne and David change for church clothes, but David can't make it because he carried the heavy drawer and gets a cut on his leg, and he starts to walk like a strong boy. And this is when David gets used to Sunja, as she becomes a real grandmother. As they go to the creek to check on the Minari, as it looks good, and David learns something about snakes. If they hide, they become more dangerous, which is an interesting thing to bring up. And I'm not an expert on snakes, but that's an interesting thing to learn about them. David overhears Monica and Sunja about David's problems, and I'm like, uh-oh. David is going to be depressed as David tells Sunja about seeing heaven while he's asleep that Monica told him earlier in the film. David sleeps and gets more comfortable, and with Sunja, and the next morning, something smells funny as David checks his underwear if it was him peeing on the carpet, and wasn't him. It was Sunja growing into an old age, has a stroke, and is taken to the hospital. And Anne and David sleeps at their friend's house for the night, and David stays with Johnny and tries tobacco for the first time, which is dangerous for kids, and they played the card game Sunja gave to David earlier in the film, and I like these characters to the point I care about them. The water comes back on the house while Sunja needs to rest as Monica wants to go back to California, and they'll decide when David has his heart checked, which will be in California at the end of the movie. Paul comes over for dinner as their first guest of the house, as he puts holy water in their house for Catholic reasons, and Jacob starts throwing him out of the house as he's a strange man, and the script is well told by this director of this movie. The whole family, except for Sunja, come to California for David's heart check, while Jacob brings in his work with him because it's too hot to leave the garden stuff in the car. And while waiting in the doctor's office, Jacob and Monica have a brief discussion about what they said at their wedding, as they said they'll go to America to save each other from Korea, as it was too hard of a life there, and Jacob gives Monica the option to leave with the kids, and here's David's heart is getting louder as it's a very good thing with Sunja burning some trash as well as the ground and the garden eventually, farm I'll say. And after their meeting with the buyer of Jacob's food, David and Anne go in the car while Jacob and Monica talk about, I'm guessing, a divorce. As they go back to Arkansas and see smoke at the garden, farm is on the marks to Sunja as Jacob tries to get the boxes of food out of the barn, and Sunja walks away from the fire to check the Minari and takes David's hand, and he and Anne take her back to the car as everything is burned down, and the cinematography looks very well in this movie. And at the end of the day, the climax is all about families sticking together, and I admire that from this movie. Now it's time for the rating. I'll give this movie a 8.4 out of 10. This is a well-made movie with some good acting and very believable characters. The cinematography looks magnificent, and the director had a very good vision of bringing this movie to life from the 1980s point of view, and does a good job with making the audience care for the characters, and the set decoration like the garden farm scenes work pretty well, and despite it's not as good as Parasite, but I liked it quite a bit, so I recommend if anyone hasn't seen this to go check this out, because this movie succeeds in Korean families very well. So I'd like to thank you guys for joining me, and next time I will be back with the Trial of the Chicago 7 sometime tomorrow. And until next time, and the Oscar goes to...